Всем привет, Alan here. How's everyone doing? So glad to see all of you. After a very long consideration, I finally decided I'm going to be upgrading this baby right here, my MSI gaming laptop, to a custom desktop PC. I'll be mainly using it for video editing and just general productivity, but it can also run top tier games if I want to, not that I really have time for that. Now I'll save you all the reasonings for a different video. This one is just based on the build itself. One disclaimer though, I am not a tech expert. At least I realized so during the last 2 weeks of researching, and the research was so daunting. And this is the first time I'm building a PC. You may or may not disagree with some of the parts I chose. Do let me know in the comment section below. I'm happy to read and learn from them. Definitely will be handy for future upgrades or builds. But I think the parts I chose is the best price performance ratio for the 1,200 euro budget that I decided to allocate to this. Now I'm currently based in Portugal, and this whole rig ran me into around 1,226 euros if I'm not wrong, and I got some of the parts at a discount, so it really depends on where you live and when you're buying it. But I thought I'll let you know the price in the beginning of the video, because there are so many videos out there on YouTube when I was researching that have these really nice builds. They don't tell you the price, and then when you start looking at all the individual parts, you realize you need to sell your body on the streets to actually afford it. So I'm gonna do it the other way and tell you the price in the beginning. Now let's go through the parts. The nervous system of this PC will be the Gigabyte B550i Aorus Pro AX motherboard. Heard good reviews about it, and it supports the latest chips available. Speaking of chips, there we go. Oh, what? You want some chips? By the way, this is not the chips we need. The CPU chip, aka the brain of our Black Beast, will be the new Ryzen 5600X. For CPU cooling, the sweat glands of the PC so to speak, I got the Noctua NH-U12S Chromax. By the way, you can save extra 10 euros by opting for the original beige color, but I went with the black one just for aesthetics purpose. And I will be combining it with the Arctic Thermal Paste. For our short-term memory aka RAM, I've got the G.Skill Aegis 16GB DDR4 3200 MHz bar. I went for 1 bar so that I can add additional one in the future, and purely from convenience standpoint. For long-term memory, I got the 256GB M2 NVMe SSD from XLR8 for the system and critical software, and a 500GB Samsung 860 EVO SATA SSD for everything else. As for the heart, aka the PSU, I went for a Corsair SF600, which has a 80 Gold Plus rating, powerful enough for future upgrades and small enough for most ITX cases and downsizing. For the computer's imagination, I went for the MSI GTX 1660 Super Ventus XS 6GB GPU. Seriously, can't the names be more complicated? After reading a number of reviews, these seemed to be the best option for beginner editing, and the next best option was the RTX 2080, which was significantly more expensive. For the sexy body, I went for the NZXT 200i. Beautiful case, especially in white. I went for a black version, which is also aesthetically pleasing, since it was the only one in stock and at a heavy discount. Paid 60 euros while the original price was 115. Moving from portability mindset was extremely difficult for me, so I went with a smaller form factor ITX case. Honestly, I wanted even smaller case, but those ones were way too expensive. Who needs a girlfriend when you got this babe? Now let's build this beast. Jeez, that sounded so nerdy. So, day 2 of the build, finally, everything's set up, everything's working super great how it turned out. I paired this computer with a 4K 27-inch monitor from Philips. I think this is by far the most affordable 4K display out there, at least from the standpoint of like entry-level monitors. I also paired it with this wireless keyboard from HP. I think it cost like 50 euros only. Super thin, super minimalistic, really love it. This might sound very controversial, but I hate those mechanical, I think it's called, keys, which has those really big keys. I hate the sound of them. I don't like the feel of it. This one feels more like laptops, which is just what I'm used to, so it feels like home. If you ask me whether I enjoyed building the whole computer, I'll tell you straight up, no. It was a pain. Of course, because this is the first time I was building a computer, but also just in general, I was basically trying to build a computer, trying to film this whole sequence at the same time, plus I was jumping between a tutorial of this specific case, how to build it, which I brought up on the TV screen in my living room, as well as looking at all the manuals coming from the case, coming from the motherboard. So yeah, it was quite tough. You know how they say everything that is good doesn't come easy, and that's exactly the same case here. It just makes it more special to use this computer knowing that I went through the whole process and the pain of actually building it for myself. Now, while building, I did face a couple of problems which I thought would be worthwhile to actually mention. Now, the first issue that I faced was screwing in the motherboard through the case. Now, as you saw, I installed the CPU cooler on the motherboard before putting everything into the case, as I saw in the different videos, including this case as well. But I quickly realized that once I put everything inside, that there is only this much space between the CPU cooler and the back plate. So the problem was that my fingers were barely even going through, and there is a screw right in the top left corner of the motherboard and the case itself. And I'm not sure how I'll be able to screw in the motherboard to the case if it was not for my screwdriver, which had a magnetic tip. Now, speaking of the same area, this motherboard has also a CPU power input also in that same corner, which made it extremely difficult for me to connect the cable, and I had to go through the pain of squeezing my fingers between the CPU cooler, scratching my fingers, and kind of trying to squeeze it in without having to actually remove the CPU cooler. I think I lost around 15 minutes doing this. So my advice would be to install the motherboard, connect all the cables, and then only install the CPU cooler. Now, the second issue that I had was the length of the power cable. Now, the Corsair SF600 PSU is meant for ITX cases and has all the cables included that you need, but out of all the cables, it's just the cable of the motherboard that is a bit too short. And I barely was able to connect it and fit the PSU in its designated place. And it was surprising for me because I saw quite a few builds with this specific case and that PSU, and no one mentioned the fact that that cable is a little bit too short. So, of course, originally I tried to route it the same way like everyone else. Basically, you connect it to the motherboard and then route the cable from the top and then the bottom, exposing all the motherboard side of it, and you have basically less cables visible in your case. And I couldn't do that. I had to route it from the bottom, which basically gives you more visible cables, and also it blocks the RGB lights from the motherboard. Not that that is very important for me personally. However, for someone who wants to have a techno club inside their case with all the different RGB lights, then of course you need to buy a longer cable for your motherboard that you can route from the top. Furthermore, because I routed the cable from the bottom, it made it a little bit difficult to install the graphics card. I basically had to push in the graphics card so that it would adjust the cable a little bit, which is a little inconvenience, but not really a big thing. Now, the third issue that I had was the clearance between the exhaust fans and the CPU cooler. This case comes with two 120mm fans, one on the back wall of the case and one on the top, working as exhaust fans. Once I installed the motherboard and the CPU cooler, as I mentioned, there was just this much space between the CPU cooler and the back wall. And it was just enough place to install a fan. However, there was not enough space to fit the fan on the top. Even though I was able to squeeze it in, I realized once I turned it on, the blades of the fan were scraping against the CPU cooler, so I had to take it out, and I eventually installed it as an intake fan on the front of the case. Now I will be getting a slimmer fan to put it on the top to work as an extra exhaust, and I might get another 120mm fan for an intake so that there's two of them, although before I will need to research to see if it actually does something or not. Some people I think say that it's pointless, and some people say that it doesn't hurt, so I'll see. I mean, anyways, they're cheap, so we'll see about that. But yeah, that is a little bit inconvenient with the CPU cooler that I chose. And the fourth and final issue that I faced, and actually today in the morning when I was trying to install this Windows, was the fact that the motherboard and BIOS itself was not booting from the USB stick which had the Windows installer on it. Now, I went to the BIOS, I chose the UFIA, I turned off the secure boot and all that kind of settings that I saw in the forums and everything. Nothing worked. What happened was, as soon as you boot the computer, it would get stuck on the Aorus logo and nothing would happen. I went through the forums, I went through the YouTube videos, and nothing helped. And finally, I was able to surprisingly figure it out myself, super proud of that. And all I had to do was to update my BIOS to the latest version, which allowed my motherboard to support the latest Ryzen 5000 series CPU chips, which I had installed. And as soon as I did it, and on the first restart, it immediately went into the Windows installer. So it took me a good maybe 10-15 minutes to kind of figure it out, but in the end I was able to do it, and now it runs flawlessly. And that's basically it when it comes to the whole build. I'm not including any temperatures or benchmarks yet because I didn't have the time to test anything. This will be the first video that I'll be editing on this computer, so then after that I'll see the performance and I can tell you something about it. The only thing I can tell you that I tried to play Just Cause 3 on this computer, and I put it on all maximum settings, worked without any problem. I'm not sure how many FPS because I didn't track it or anything, but I can tell you that the GPU was running at around 75 degrees Celsius on its base clock. I don't know if it's good or not. Again, this is something I need to research, and I will be doing it when I'll look into the whole overclocking thing. So if you really want to know the temperature and benchmarks and all that stuff, do let me know in the comment section below, and I'll be happy to look into this, learn how to do this, and then arrange all this data for you. Thank you for watching, have a nice day, and I see you in the next one. Пока!